Okay, our next segment, roadside development and erosion and sediment control. And I can't think of a better photo for that. This is a gorgeous photo, by the way. And with us is Rob Marshall, and he is the Roadside Development Program leader. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And also the Erosion and Sediment Control Program leader. And those are the two subjects I'm going to talk about. I have been with the agency for about 3.5 years, and prior to that, I worked as a landscape architect for David Evans and Associates for more than 25 years. So I got a lot to cover, so let's go. Roadside development. In 2014, the Oregon Values Project surveyed over 9,000 Oregonians, and they summarized that project in that values related to environmental quality are paramount to Oregon's citizens. And that's kind of the values that roadside development tries to carry. Roadsides, they strengthen, the roadside views strengthen the tourist economy. Roadside development supports the values of environmental that is cherished by Oregonians. Most ODOT roadside projects will be required by permit, and be aware that there is a directive that if ornamental landscapes are going to be used on a project, that the local agency needs to request those ornamental landscapes, and they need to sign a intergovernmental agreement to own the maintenance of that. Roadside development provides more than plantings. We provide hardscape, and landscape architecture provides the interface between the built and the natural environment, and that's exactly where roadsides reside. Roadsides plantings and treatments form landmarks and kind of define the character of a place. And attractive roadsides improve property values and the quality of life. Conversely, unattractive roadsides are going to last in the landscape for decades. The treatments will shape the community's perceptions of ODOT and the surrounding community. So if you've got design-build projects or value engineering, keep in mind that your engineered solutions can be devised to be attractive. Roadside development, we're all acquainted now with the racetrack. We need to get the issues that roadside development touches on involved in the project early. This would be during scoping. So you want to look, are there going to be views in the project that you want to protect? Are there going to be unsightly views in the project that you want to hide? How is your project going to look from adjacent properties? So maybe your project's going to be providing a gateway, or might be some other visual features in the landscape. And then there's natural features. Are there going to be wetlands or waterways or steep slopes that need to be permitted and protected? And again, everything that roadside development involves is going to be owned by maintenance at the end of construction, so they need to be involved in the development process. Hello. There it is. So rural roadsides have a distinctive characteristic. They're going to be viewed at a distance and at speed. So anything that's fussy or detailed is inappropriate. What we want to see is that the rural roadsides retain the context of the surrounding landscape. We want to use native plants. These are going to be drought tolerant. Wildflowers could be appropriate. They could also serve as pollinator habitat. We don't want to provide any kind of landscaping that would provide cover for large wildlife. We need to maintain a safe runoff and recovery zone. If possible, we want to create roadside landscapes that do not require mowing. And you'll notice on this slide that there is a multi-use path off to the side. Also, roadside development will be addressing wildlife crossings. This is to ensure safety for motorists as well as for wildlife. Wildlife crossings will help retain historic migration routes so that entire populations won't have to learn new migration routes. Wildlife crossings will require fencing to funnel the animals into the crossing. And be aware that a bill has been passed, that's 2834, that requires ODOT to consider wildlife crossings if their project is located where there is a historic migration route or incidents of high volume of vehicle-wildlife collisions. Rural roadsides, on the other hand, have a completely different set of criteria. The landscape plantings along the roadside, they help act as traffic calming because the vegetation on the roadsides creates a perception of a narrower right-of-way, and that changes the context of the road, and motorists are more inclined to accept that speed limits are lower. The urban roadside landscapes, they're going to be providing cooling shade. They're going to make the pedestrian experience more pleasant. They intercept particulate matter and pollution, and so there's a lot of advantages to having a more detailed roadside landscape. Also be aware that the roadside landscape in urban areas is extremely harsh for the vegetation. The soils on roadsides are sterile mineral soils that are likely compacted. There is less opportunity for water to infiltrate into the soil, and the vegetation is going to be bombarded by reflected heat and light, so it makes for a very harsh environment. Also recall that these type of landscapes will require maintenance, and so make sure that you've got some kind of parking, that you don't need traffic control just to conduct standard maintenance. Other types of roadside maintenance might be used to diminish the area of the mowed landscape. That's desirable. The less mowing, there's going to be a cost savings with that, a fuel use reduction. If we've got roadside treatments where we've got islands of vegetation, you want to make these islands in a geometry that is easy to follow with a mower. You want to create these islands so that they're going to be low maintenance, so a density of planting is appropriate, but you don't want to create a landscape that's going to harbor urban campers or large wildlife. So another advantage to this is that once the vegetation matures and gets taller, motorists will see it from a greater distance, and it will actually kind of announce the location of an intersection where this type of a treatment might be used. And then we have the required plantings. These plantings, they could be to repair or replace wetlands that are impacted by project work. It could be to replace floodplain storage in case we had fill in a floodplain. It could be riparian vegetation to provide shade and habitat by a stream impacted by our work. These are going to be science-based plantings, and they are designed to replicate the native plant communities, and failure for this is not an option. This is required work by permit, as Teresa mentioned, and after construction of this, these are going to be monitored for 5 years to verify that they meet the success criteria. If the success criteria are not met, a new project will have to be initiated and a new contract signed to perform the maintenance and repair on the landscape until the success criteria is met. So it can be really nice work, like the one in the photo here. And so the takeaways regarding roadside development: aesthetics matter. You want to include the roadside development items during scoping early in the project. You need to engage maintenance because they're going to be owning this work after construction is over with, and that much of the roadside development work is required as a permit condition. So roadside, yay. Erosion and sediment control is also required work. This is contracted work, and it is required by permit. So again, failure is not an option. As Teresa mentioned, that we've got the permits can take quite a long time. Erosion and sediment control has a standing programmatic permit, the 1200 CA, and this permit, the use of this permit, can eliminate 6 to 12 months of permitting time from project delivery. So it counts. Federal funding, you heard that, federal funding, is permitted through the Federal Aid Highway Program, and that depends on the 1200 CA compliance. So 1200 CA, Erosion and Sediment Control, supports the Endangered Species Act and the FAP federal funding that is enabled by it. So good erosion and sediment control outcomes will help ODOT retain its trusted advisor status with regulatory agencies. It is important to differentiate between erosion and sedimentation. Erosion is the displacement and transport of soil from a location, and sedimentation is the deposition of that sediment in another location. Erosion scars the landscape and removes living topsoil, and sediment, once it enters the waterways, is considered a pollutant. And understand that erosion is much easier to control than sedimentation. Consider that a half an inch of rain over 1 acre has a volume of 67 cubic yards. It is easier to protect 1 acre of ground than it is to remove sediment from 67 cubic yards of turbid water. So erosion, the process, erosion's not going to happen where vegetation is intact. That covers the soil. It is actually the best management practice, and it is the model which erosion control practices try to emulate. On exposed soil, a raindrop will have a terminal velocity of about 20 miles an hour. When it hits exposed soil, it will dislodge soil particles. Those dislodged particles will be carried by the runoff first in a shallow film called sheet flow, but that quickly organizes into shallow channels called rills. And once in the rills, the velocity of the runoff accelerates, making it more destructive. Soon after that, the rills will combine into gullies. So now you've got more acceleration on the runoff and greater volume. So the destructive or erosive potential becomes much greater. So what you need to do is cover the soil. That protects it from the rain splash. You need to cover the soil with material that will retain moisture. That could be mulch or straw or matting or bonded fiber matrix, because if you're retaining the moisture, it's not running off. You need to reduce the runoff velocity. You can do that with check dams in the rills, or the sheet flow could be arrested by straw wattles placed on contour on slopes. And then you want to replace the removed vegetation with new vegetation as the final cover. When you are on your project, it's important to know what your watersheds are, what the capture area for a channel is going to be, and evaluate the steepness of a slope. If the slope is going to be too steep or the watershed too great, then a lighter grade erosion control measure like check dams might not be the proper BMP. A situation like the picture on the left with the concentrated flow could better have been addressed with a temporary slope drain. And another type of erosion is the pop-out or the shallow planar slide. This occurs when the surface layer of soil becomes saturated and it swells with the water and it becomes lubricated from the water and it is just released from the surface layer of the slope. This can be prevented by providing a cover which retains moisture. Again, that could be compost or matting or bonded fiber matrix. But if you are retaining the moisture on the surface cover, then it's not penetrating the surface layer of soil, and you can prevent ugly messes like the one shown on this photo. Sediment, once it enters the water, if this is from your project work, that it means that you've got erosion and sediment control failures on your project and that you are in violation of your permit condition. Sediment, once it falls out of suspension in waters of the state, will cover the gravels that are salmon nests. Turbid water intercepts sunlight, and the warm water can hold less oxygen, making it less capable of holding life. It blocks sunlight. The turbid water prevents sunlight from getting down and allowing photosynthesis in aquatic plants, and that rattles up the food chain. Sediment can carry pollutants. In turbid water, it's harder for predatory fish to see prey. If you consider that a fish's gills is delicate enough to filter oxygen from water, consider what the abrasive particles in their atmosphere can do to them. At the best case, they might just avoid the area, but unfortunately, the effects can be lethal. And we look back at federal funding and our programmatic federal aid highway program. We have an obligation to protect endangered species, of which salmon are included. So let's not put sediment in the water. But we will get sediment. Stuff happens. So what do we do to capture sediment? We need to have our projects with a perimeter sediment control. We can have intermediate sediment control on slopes. Those could be straw wattles or compost socks. Perimeter control could be a sediment fence or straw wattle or compost. We need to reduce flow velocity in ditches. That can be done with check dams. We can divert or capture flows. That could be done with a temporary slope drain or just a plastic sheeting flume. Sediment traps work really well, and those are just basins where still water will allow water to fall out of suspension. You could discharge sediment-laden water into vegetation on the project site, and then there are chemical and electrical treatments for turbid water that will change the ionic charge of that water so that the particles will aggregate to where they're large enough and heavy enough to fall out of suspension. So there are tools that we can use to remove sediment from water. In the contract plans, we will have the agency's erosion and sediment control plans. We need to make sure that these plans are comprehensive. So does the agency plan cover soil, retain water, reduce runoff velocity, capture or divert flowing water to control erosion? Does the erosion and sediment control plan provide perimeter control to trap sediment, treat sediment, and to prevent sediment from leaving the project site? Does the ESCP provide emergency materials and address wet weather needs and have a final phase stabilization? And does your plan does it cover all the permit requirements? The project erosion and sediment control plan is a different beast entirely. This is owned by the contractor, and the contractor may use the agency's erosion and sediment control plan if it is approved by the project manager. So the project manager needs to well consider that the agency plan is comprehensive. The project ESCP will include the plan, the implementation of the plan throughout phased construction. The project ESCP is a living document, so it is not only expected, it's written into our specs that this is to be modified and upgraded to keep it synchronized with the phases of construction. The updates are required to address the means and methods, the scheduling, the monitoring, maintenance, repair, and removal. And in all cases, ODOT is the permittee, so even though the contractor owns the plans, responsibility remains on the shoulders of the agency. So during construction, does the contractor consider erosion and sediment control work to be as important as other contracted work? Is the contractor proactive in installing erosion and sediment controlled BMPs? Are the required features installed as shown on plans? Is the inspector requiring the contractor to address issues on the ground? And is the inspector seeing erosion and sediment control successes and needs and fails? Does anybody notice there might be something missing from this photo? You don't have to answer. During construction, is the contractor conducting maintenance as required? Is the contractor submitting honest, thorough monitoring forms as required? Are they updating the erosion and sediment control as required? Is the agency reporting violations, self-reporting violations as required? And is the agency and the contractor willful and proactive in addressing erosion and sediment control? So the takeaway from erosion and sediment control, the programmatic permit and its benefits depend on reliable and consistent compliance. The project delivery advantages of the programmatic permit are not readily apparent during the construction phase for the construction personnel. I take it upon myself that erosion and sediment control designers can improve their output, and that the agency enforcement of erosion and sediment control requirements can be strengthened. So again, I'm Bob Marshall, and I'm here to be a resource for you. You can find me on the web, and so give me a call and let me know if I can help you out with your projects. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for questions.
Awesome.
Please, does anyone have any questions for Rob? It's got to be one.
I must have nailed it.
Okay, Justin has a question.
Afternoon, Bob. In regards to local agency projects, who's expected to carry the permit, the local agency or ODOT?
The local agency. The local agency will, well, it depends on the project, but by and large, the local agency will usually have the permit. It's often the case that the project will be funded by money funneled through ODOT, but the local agencies will most often have to have their own permit.
Other questions? Yes, Reem has a question.
So I heard you talking about the wildlife crossing. So is it going to be a new requirement?
Wildlife crossing, say again?
You mentioned about the wildlife crossing, and I heard it, several times during today. So is it a new requirement in our project development?
I'm sorry, I still didn't hear.
Okay.
Right now, wildlife crossings are not required, but it is required that ODOT consider the need for wildlife crossings. They're supposed to take into account if there is a high incidence of vehicle-wildlife collisions, and there are, like the mule deer around La Pine, there are known migration routes. So if a project is going to occur in any of these wildlife hotspots, it is incumbent on ODOT to consider how they might improve safety for people and for wildlife. We love our critters, and we don't want to kill them.
Other questions? Any? Going once, going twice, gone. Rob, thank you so much. Well done.